Staying low-key isn't weakness. It's a form of power few are willing to hold. Most people believe that if you don't talk about what you're doing, if you don't showcase your achievements, prove your effort, or constantly explain yourself, then you must be losing. They assume silence means you're falling behind, that if no one sees you moving forward, then you probably aren't moving at all. But what if that belief is completely backward? What if staying low-key isn't a lack of confidence, but a sign of someone who no longer needs validation? We live in a world where noise is mistaken for strength. The one who speaks the loudest is seen as the leader. The one who shows the most is assumed to be in control. Social media has trained people to believe that if you don't make your journey public, don't post progress updates, don't turn effort into content, then that effort somehow doesn't exist. And that's when working in silence starts to look suspicious. People begin to ask, "What are you working on? What's your plan? Why aren't you saying anything?" But Stoicism never taught people to prove strength through noise. It taught them to build inner power long before the world ever notices. Marcus Aurelius wrote for himself, not for an audience. His most powerful reflections were never meant to impress anyone. They were meant to keep his own mind from drifting. That is the core of working in silence. Not because you have nothing to say, but because you understand this. Every ounce of energy spent explaining is energy taken away from building. When you stay low-key, you stop playing the win-lose game of public opinion. You stop measuring your worth by the reaction of the crowd. Instead, you take on something far more difficult. Building without applause, moving forward without validation, and staying disciplined even when no one is watching. That's why this phase is so uncomfortable. Not because it's weak, but because it strips away everything you once used to avoid the truth. When you stop announcing your plans, you can no longer rely on words to feel like you've done enough. When you stop showcasing progress, you can't use recognition to compensate for a lack of discipline. Silence reveals one thing with brutal clarity. Are you actually doing the work, or just telling a story about yourself? And this is why most people can't tolerate working in silence. Because silence doesn't just remove the audience, it removes the excuses. No one sees you trying, which means you can't blame a lack of results on being unrecognized. No one knows what you're building, which means if you quit, you'll be the only one who knows. The Stoics called this absolute responsibility. No witnesses, no praise, no external pressure. Just you, and the question you can't escape. If no one is watching, will I still do it? Staying low-key means you no longer work to be seen. You work because you know exactly who you're becoming. And when you understand that, another truth begins to surface. Not about the world, but about your own ego. And that's where the next part begins. When you go silent, the ego starts to speak. When you stop telling the world what you're doing, something deeply uncomfortable happens. Not outside of you, but inside. Because silence doesn't just quiet the world, it takes away your ego's support system. For years, many of us have been conditioned to feel like we're making progress simply because we're talking about progress. A plan announced, a goal shared, a direction explained. And in that very moment, the brain receives a reward, not for action, but for anticipated recognition. The Stoics didn't call this evil. They called it a subtle form of self-deception. Because when you speak too early, the ego starts collecting rewards before the real work has even begun. You feel like the kind of person who's doing the work, when in reality, you're just the person talking about it. Working in silence cuts this mechanism off completely. No one asks, no one praises, no one reassures you that you're on the right path. And that's when the ego becomes restless. It whispers, "Why not share just a little? Why not let people know you're serious? Why suffer quietly like this?" Not because you need them to know, but because the ego needs to feel important. Epictetus once said that the most dangerous kind of slavery is not being chained, but being unable to act without an audience. When you stay low-key, you strip the ego of its power in the most direct way possible. You deny it a stage. No spotlight, no instant feedback, no constant comparison. Only one raw, honest question remains. Do I have the discipline to continue when no one knows? This is where most people quit. Not because the work is too hard, but because invisibility is too heavy. When you work in silence, nothing confirms that you're on the right track. There are no social signals telling you, "Keep going, others see it too." You're forced to build what the Stoics called inner authority. The ability to say to yourself, "No one sees it yet, but I know. No one has acknowledged it, but I'm not lost. No one is asking, but I continue." This is not loud confidence. This is steadiness that doesn't need proof. Marcus Aurelius didn't keep a journal to inspire future generations. He wrote because he understood something essential. If the mind isn't trained in solitude, it will always be led by external noise. Staying low-key forces you to confront another uncomfortable truth. Much of your past motivation didn't come from purpose. It came from being seen. When that disappears, you discover what's real. You begin to notice days when you don't want to do anything, not because you're tired, but because no one is watching. And in that moment, your true character is revealed. Not who you perform as, but who you are when there's no social reward. Stoicism doesn't demand that you need no one. It simply warns you not to become someone who can't function without validation. Working in silence is the test. It asks one simple, ruthless question. If no one knows, will you still do it? If the answer is yes, you're building real strength. If the answer is no, at least now you know what you've been dependent on. And from that clarity, a deeper transformation begins. No longer centered on image, no longer driven by reputation, but built around something far more difficult, an identity that doesn't require an audience. And that is exactly where this story continues. Silence doesn't create strength. It only reveals what you already have. Many people believe that simply staying still, being quiet, or keeping a low profile will automatically make them stronger. But Stoicism never made that claim. Silence is not a miracle. It doesn't create discipline. It doesn't grant character. It doesn't magically turn you into a deeper person. Silence does only one thing. It removes noise. And when the noise disappears, what remains becomes unmistakably clear. If you have direction inside you, silence sharpens it. If you carry procrastination, avoidance, or confusion, silence exposes it without mercy. That's why working in silence is uncomfortable, because it doesn't allow you to distract yourself. When there are no updates to post, no journey to narrate, no feedback to lean on, you're forced to confront a single, fundamental question. What am I actually doing every day? Not what you say you'll do, not what you plan to do, but what you did when no one was watching. The Stoics called this the difference between intention and behavior. Many people live on intention. They have plans, they have vision, they tell compelling stories about their future. But when the noise fades, intention can no longer protect behavior. Staying low-key forces these two to meet. And that moment is often uncomfortable. You realize that you talk about discipline more than you live it. You speak about focus more than you practice it. You talk about freedom more than you accept responsibility. People don't do this because they're dishonest. They do it because they're avoiding pain. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself not to waste the rest of his life arguing about what a good person should be, but to be one. Working in silence is the most practical way to do that, because when no one is watching, no one expects, no one applauds, every action becomes pure. You don't act to be recognized. You don't act to prove anything. You act because if you don't, you have to live with self-contempt. And that is a very different kind of motivation. Not external pressure, but internal consistency. When you stay silent long enough, you begin to feel even the smallest misalignment between your words and your actions. A skipped task. A morning delayed for no real reason. A habit broken because it won't matter. Before, these things were buried under noise. Now they stand alone. And here, a new kind of strength begins to form. Not the strength of image, but the strength of integrity. The Stoics believed a person cannot be strong on the outside if they are constantly defending themselves on the inside. Silence cuts off the need for defense. There's no one left to explain to. No one left to justify yourself to. Only one clear truth remains. Are you living up to your own standards or not? And when the answer is not yet, silence gives you no escape. You either raise your standard of action or you face the discomfort of self-betrayal. Most people return to noise. They return to sharing. They return to explaining. They return to talking about what they're about to do. Not because they're bad, but because silence demands something rare. Maturity without witnesses. But if you endure this phase, something else begins to happen. You no longer need motivation to start. You start because not starting feels unstable. Discipline stops feeling like force. It becomes a way of maintaining self-respect. And from here, working in silence stops being a strategy. It becomes an identity. You're not quiet to impress. You're quiet because you're busy. Building someone you see, don't want to betray. And once that identity takes shape, a very practical shift begins to appear in daily life. Invisible discipline. What no one sees, yet determines everything. When you've worked in silence long enough, something begins to change clearly, yet almost no one notices it. Not your results, not your position, not your outward image, but your internal rhythm. You begin to wake up and work not because of motivation, not because of inspiration, but because it's simply what must be done. No one tracks your progress. No one waits for updates. No one checks in. And because of that, your discipline either collapses or becomes real. The Stoics never saw discipline as self-punishment. They saw it as the ability to act in alignment with values, even when emotions don't cooperate. Working in silence creates the ideal conditions for this kind of discipline, because it removes every secondary reward. No one praises you for being dedicated. No one says, "You're really working hard." No one witnesses the mornings you don't want to begin, but do anyway. Only one bare truth remains. Are you keeping your word to yourself or not? This is where the difference between real discipline and performative discipline becomes obvious. Performative discipline needs eyes. It survives on social pressure. It's strong when observed and weak the moment there's no one to impress. Invisible discipline is the opposite. It doesn't increase with an audience, and it doesn't fade without one. It exists because without it, your identity would fracture. Marcus Aurelius wrote that you should not live as if you have 10,000 years ahead of you. Time has already been given, and it must be used well. Working in silence makes this painfully practical. You begin to feel that time is no longer something to waste. Not because you fear loss, but because you see clearly that every day is either building you or eroding you. When you're no longer pulled into social comparison, no longer measuring yourself against others' timelines, you begin to move at your own pace. Not rushed, not delayed, just right. And that rhythm creates a different kind of stability. You don't need constant self-motivation. You don't need to push yourself to try harder. You simply don't break the chain you've chosen. The Stoics called this constancy, quiet persistence. Not impressive, not dramatic, but nearly unbeatable over time. Staying low-key protects this rhythm, because the fewer people who know, the fewer forces can pull you away from it. No unsolicited advice, no unconscious comparison, no pressure to prove speed, only a direct relationship between you and the work. And in that relationship, you learn something essential. Discipline isn't what you use to push yourself further. It's what keeps you from betraying yourself. Every day you maintain this rhythm, you don't just make progress. You reinforce a belief. I am someone who does what I tell myself I will do. That belief is small, but it accumulates. And when it becomes solid, you no longer need motivation. You just need to protect the structure you've built. That's why truly strong people rarely talk much about discipline. Not because they have nothing to say, but because their discipline doesn't need to be spoken to exist. And when this rhythm stabilizes, another shift begins. Not in what you do, but in how you see the world around you. When you stop comparing, life starts to become clear. One of the biggest changes that happens when you stay low-key is not that you do more, but that you look less. You look less at other people. You follow fewer journeys that aren't yours. You spend less time asking where you stand compared to the world. Not because you stop caring, but because you realize this. Every time you compare yourself, you allow something external to shape how you feel inside. The Stoics understood this very early on. Not because they rejected society, but because they knew how easily the human mind gets pulled off course by whatever it sees repeatedly. Comparison isn't dangerous because it's wrong. It's dangerous because it's constant. Every day you see someone else's success, your brain quietly asks, "Have I done enough? Am I falling behind? Am I too slow?" And no matter how rational you are, those questions leave small scratches behind. Working in silence reduces this naturally. When you stop announcing your progress, you also stop tracking everyone else's. When you don't need to update, you don't need to compare. Slowly, something shifts. Your standards move inward. You no longer measure today by who did better than you. You measure it with a much simpler question. Did I keep my rhythm today? That question changes everything. There's no rush anymore, no pressure to catch up, no vague fear that you're being left behind. You begin to realize that much of the pressure you once felt didn't come from reality, but from watching too many lives that were never yours to live. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself, "Don't let your mind be dragged around by things outside your control. Other people's success is not within your control. Their pace is not a measure of your worth." Staying low-key helps you live this principle, not in theory, but in daily practice. You gain more mental space, fewer voices competing for attention, less unnecessary doubt, less need to prove anything. And in that space, focus sharpens. You no longer work to keep up. You work to build what you've chosen. This calm is often misunderstood. From the outside, people may think you're slow. They may think you lack ambition. They may think you're standing still. But you know the truth. You're not standing still. You're just no longer chasing noise. The Stoics didn't believe in living faster than others. They believed in living truer to oneself. And when comparison no longer pulls at you, something important happens. You begin to see clearly what's actually worth doing. Not what looks good. Not what gets recognition easily. But what aligns with your long-term direction. You stop changing course just because someone else is succeeding faster. You stop doubting your decisions just because others chose differently. You begin to trust your own rhythm, not because it's fast, but because it's sustainable. And when you trust your rhythm, you don't need to talk much. The results may not be visible yet, but stability has already arrived. And from that stability, a deeper shift begins to form. Not in your work, but in how you face yourself when there's no noise left to hide behind. When silence starts to reveal who you really are, there's something very few people say out loud. Silence is not always comfortable. When you stop posting updates, when you stop sharing progress, when there's no feedback, no applause, no confirming glances, silence begins to do something ruthless. It exposes you to yourself. No noise to cover things up. No busyness to distract you. No working on something to avoid the most important question. How am I actually living? Many people fear this phase, not because they're weak, but because they've learned to use movement to avoid facing their inner world. Stoicism doesn't treat solitude as an enemy. It treats it as a test. When no one is watching, do you still keep your discipline? When no one knows, do you still do the right thing? When there's no recognition, do you continue? Silence answers those questions directly. And at first, the answers can be uncomfortable. You realize how much you did just to be seen. You realize that some days you worked not because of purpose, but because you feared the emptiness of doing nothing. When you work in silence, there's nowhere to hide from that emptiness. Evenings feel longer. Thoughts get louder. The questions you avoided start returning. But the Stoics believed this. What you avoid most is often where you need to stand still the longest. Silence doesn't come to punish you. It comes to teach you the difference between real motivation and dependence on external validation. When you're alone long enough, you start noticing subtle truths. You need less than you thought, less affirmation, less constant busyness, less visible progress in front of others. You learn to sit with yourself without panicking. This is a rare skill. And it doesn't come from books. It comes from staying with silence long enough. Marcus Aurelius wrote for himself, not for the world. His deepest thoughts were written in solitude, not to impress, not to be recognized. And that's precisely why his words survived for thousands of years. When you work in silence, you begin doing the same thing on a smaller scale. Building inward foundations before seeking outward influence. You learn to self-correct, to self-evaluate, to take responsibility. There's no one left to blame, no one left to impress, just you and your standards. And if you pass through this phase, something profound happens. You no longer fear silence. You rely on it. You use it to think more clearly, to decide more slowly, but more firmly, to act less, but more accurately. You no longer need to be busy to feel valuable. Your worth no longer depends on whether anyone saw you today. And from that moment, real freedom begins to appear. But when you no longer need attention, a new question arises. How do you maintain discipline when there is no external pressure at all? True discipline begins when no one is reminding you. Here's a hard but accurate truth. Discipline is not measured on days you feel motivated. It's measured on days when no emotion is on your side. When you work in silence, you lose many things that once helped you push through. No public deadlines, no one tracking your progress, no promises made in front of others, no expectant eyes. And that's when the true nature of discipline reveals itself. Stoicism doesn't see discipline as force. It sees it as a quiet commitment to yourself. No one needs to know. No one needs to praise you. No one needs to witness it. You do the work because it is the work. The hardest days aren't the busy ones. They're the empty ones. Days with no clear reason to start. Days where skipping wouldn't be noticed by anyone. Those are the days that shape who you become. Marcus Aurelius once asked himself, "If this is the right thing to do, why am I waiting for emotion to permit it?" That question cuts straight to the point. Stoic discipline doesn't require motivation. It requires clarity. Clarity about what's within your control. Clarity about what deserves action, regardless of mood. When you stop sharing progress, your brain stops receiving instant rewards. No dopamine from likes. No feeling of accomplishment from feedback. You're forced to learn a new skill, working without immediate reward. This is where many people quit. Not because they lack ability, but because they're accustomed to being fueled by external validation. Working in silence removes that comfort. But in return, it gives you something far stronger: self-mastery. You begin to build systems that don't rely on emotion. Fixed schedules, simple rituals, clear standards. Nothing complicated. Just repetition. The Stoics believed that a good life isn't built on big decisions, but on small actions repeated with intention. You don't need to explode every day. You just need to not betray yourself. There are mornings you wake up with no desire to do anything. No inspiration, no energy, no convincing reason. And you do it anyway. Not out of excitement, but because you decided beforehand. That is Stoic discipline. Quiet, unemotional, but reliable. You don't have to trust your feelings. You only have to trust the system you chose. And when that system is maintained long enough, something unexpected happens. You begin to respect yourself more. Not because of major achievements, but because you know this. When no one is watching, you still keep your word. That self-respect doesn't show off. It doesn't announce itself. But it straightens your posture, steadies your gaze, sharpens your decisions. And from that foundation, you become far less vulnerable to praise or criticism. And when discipline becomes habit, a deeper question emerges. Are you working for your ego or for a value that rises above it? Being invisible is not weakness, it's that you no longer need to prove anything. There is a very particular phase on the path of staying low-key and working in silence. You no longer feel the urge to be seen, not because you fear attention, not because you lack confidence, but because you arrive at a quiet realization. Not everything you achieve needs to be displayed. Stoicism is not against achievement. It is against tying your self-worth to whether or not others notice. The ego is subtle. It doesn't only show up when you boast. It also appears when you share just for fun, when you document the journey, when you try to inspire. Not because those things are wrong, but because it's easy to slide into a different question. Would I still do this if no one knew? Working in silence is the Stoic way of asking that question every day without saying it out loud. When you reach a milestone and don't post it, the ego reacts. It whispers, "What a waste. No one knows how hard you worked. At least let people see it." If you observe closely, you'll notice something important. The discomfort doesn't come from the achievement. It comes from the lack of validation. This is a subtle test. The Stoics believed the ego doesn't need to be destroyed. It needs to be put in its proper place. You don't need to be invisible forever. You only need to be strong enough to not depend on the spotlight. Intentional invisibility is not avoidance. It is self-command. You choose when to appear. You choose when to speak. You choose when to let results speak for you. The insecure need to be seen in order to feel real. The grounded remain real even when no one is watching. Marcus Aurelius was an emperor, yet his deepest thoughts were never written for the public. They were private conversations between him and himself. That tells us something important. Real strength does not require an audience. When you grow comfortable not displaying everything, you begin working for purer reasons, not to outshine others, not to be acknowledged, but because the work aligns with the person you're becoming. You stop feeling rushed to prove yourself. You stop feeling pressure to launch too soon. You become more patient with the process. And that patience becomes a major advantage. You don't rush stages. You don't perform before you're ready. You don't trap yourself in an image you now have to maintain. You allow yourself to learn in the dark, to fail quietly, to adjust without being scrutinized. Many people fail not because they lack ability, but because they reveal themselves too early and get stuck in an outdated version of who they are. Working in silence protects you from that trap. When you finally do step into view, you don't need to say much. No long explanations, no persuasion, no self-promotion. Maturity shows in how you speak, in what you choose to say and not say, in a calm that doesn't need to be forced. By then, the ego is no longer in the driver's seat. It becomes a passenger. But when the ego stops pushing you, another question arises. How do you know when to step into the light and when to remain in silence? Knowing when to stay silent and when to step forward. Silence is not about hiding forever. And visibility does not automatically mean showing off. Stoicism teaches something subtle but crucial. Every action has its proper timing. The issue isn't whether you appear or not, but why you appear. Many people step forward too early, not because they're ready, but because they're impatient. Impatient for recognition. Impatient to prove they're not behind. Impatient to show the world they're doing something. The Stoics saw impatience as a sign of inner instability. If you cannot tolerate being unseen, it's very hard to remain steady when you're seen too much. Working in silence gives you a rare advantage: time to mature, not just in skill, but in mindset. You learn to do good work without immediate results. You learn to endure long processes without losing your balance. At that point, the question shifts. It's no longer, when should I step forward? It becomes, if I step forward today, am I stable enough to not be pulled off course? Stoicism does not warn you away from the spotlight. It simply reminds you. Light reveals both strengths and weaknesses. If your foundation isn't solid, attention becomes a distraction. Praise feeds illusion. Criticism shakes you. So how do you know when the timing is right? There is one clear sign, and few people notice it. You're ready to step forward when you no longer need to. When being seen no longer affects how you value yourself. When you can appear publicly without changing how you work tomorrow. If you're praised today, you keep the same rhythm. If you're ignored today, you keep the same rhythm. That is maturity. Marcus Aurelius didn't seek admiration. He sought to fulfill his duty properly. Reputation, if it came, was a consequence, not the goal. Working in silence helps you understand this deeply. You stop asking, what do people think of me? You start asking, is what I'm doing aligned with the principles I've chosen? And when the answer is yes, there's no rush. You let time do its work. You let results accumulate. You let difference become visible on its own. When you step forward at the right moment, you don't need to raise your voice. No performance, no grand announcement, no self-introduction. The difference is felt. The impatient need to explain. The grounded let others notice. And even when you do step forward, you keep a part of yourself in silence. You don't share everything. You don't expose every corner of your life. You don't give the world full access to your inner domain. The Stoics called this preserving inner sovereignty. You are present, but not dependent. You participate without losing yourself. And when you finally know how to appear at the right time, one last question quietly emerges. After everything, who are you really building this life for? In the end, who are you living for? After everything you've walked through, silence, discipline, invisibility, patience, one unavoidable question slowly rises. If no one were watching, how would you still choose to live this life? This isn't a philosophical question meant to sound deep. It's a Stoic question meant to guide every action. Many people live as if there's always an invisible audience in front of them. Every decision is subtly adjusted to look acceptable, to avoid judgment, to not fall behind. But when you stay low-key long enough, that audience begins to disappear. And in that moment, you're faced with a very raw truth. No one lives this life for you. Stoicism doesn't promise easy happiness. It promises only one thing: integrity with yourself. Marcus Aurelius repeated this idea again and again. You can control your thoughts, your actions, and how you respond to circumstances. Everything else, Reputation, outcomes, recognition is secondary. When you work in silence, you begin to understand why that matters. You stop working for applause. You stop choosing paths just because they look successful. You begin asking slower, but far more honest questions. Does this align with my values? Does this help me become someone I respect? If no one ever knew, would I still choose it? These aren't questions you can answer with temporary emotion, and that's exactly why so few people stay with them long enough. But if you do answer them, you gain a rare kind of freedom. You no longer have to perform. You no longer have to maintain an image. You no longer have to run at someone else's pace. You live as if each day is a private commitment between you and your conscience. The Stoics called this living in accordance with your nature. Not doing whatever you want, but doing what you believe is right, even when it isn't celebrated. You don't need the world to agree in order to continue. You only need to not betray the values you've chosen. And when you live this way long enough, results may come, or they may not. But one thing will appear without fail: inner calm. You sleep better. You decide with less hesitation. You no longer carry the quiet fear that you're living someone else's life. You understand something simple and profound. A good life doesn't need to be loud. It only needs to be true. Stay low-key. Work in silence, not to hide from the world, but to avoid losing yourself inside it. If you've listened this far, you're probably already walking a path with less noise and more depth. If this video resonated with you, tap like to support the channel. Subscribe to Stoic Crowned Silence to continue exploring discipline, silence, and inner strength. And leave a comment below. In what area of your life are you learning to stay silent? We don't need to say much. We just need to walk in the same direction. Stoic Crowned Silence.